May the words of my lips and the thoughts of each one of us be acceptable to you, Lord God, now and always. Amen. A good measure of how easy it is to understand certain events in Jesus' life is to look at what artists have done, how they've represented it. The images of the Nativity and of the Crucifixion and even the Transfiguration are easily understandable and reflect aspects of human life. When it comes to the Ascension, however, artists have struggled. Many artists have represented Jesus' ascension with the Christ figure hovering above the heads of the disciples. There's something quite unsettling about an image of the Jesus figure as some kind of fantasy, hovering like a creature with invisible wings, 8 foot in the air. There have been some more creative attempts which focus on Jesus' feet and his separation from the ground, as it were, becoming unanchored from the creation that we know. There's a 1513 painting by Kulmbach. Still has the disciples, but the depiction of Jesus is limited to a cloud, and below the cloud, his lower legs. In York Minster, if you look carefully at one of the roof bosses, you will see a set of soles of feet looking down on you. And that's a little bit theologically inadequate, because they're healed feet, they're not injured feet. And theologically and biblically, the feet really need to have some damage. However, they did their best. Probably the best one, the most dramatic of all, is in the Chapel of the Ascension at the Walsingham Shrine in England. There, above the altar, set into the ceiling, is a three-dimensional depiction of Jesus' feet. They're wounded, and there are little rays of light shining from the toes. It is a brave attempt, but it gives us some idea of how difficult it is to capture the Ascension. And that's part of the difficulty about Ascension. The accounts of Jesus' conception, resurrection and ascension are continual challenges for us. They're challenges to God's natural order. Jesus is born as one of us, lives as one of us, dies as one of us. But God suspends God's own natural order for it to be so. This should not be a surprise. After all, the whole idea of God entering physically into creation is a challenge to God's natural order. But the Ascension seems to take things just a bit further. It almost flaunts a moment which is completely other. And for some, this is even more unbelievable than Jesus' conception or bodily resurrection. Yet Ascension, Jesus' Ascension, is absolutely necessary and the inevitable outcome of all that has gone before and all that is to follow. One way to consider this is, what would the situation be like if Jesus had not ascended? Let's start with that. Would Jesus simply have remained in Jerusalem? Would the disciples have gone anywhere, let alone to the ends of the world? Would there be any sense that Jesus was present anywhere other than Jerusalem? Jesus had to go. After the resurrection, after the time with the disciples, Jesus had to leave in order to allow them to fulfill their own mission. And as Jesus was resurrected in bodily form, then he had to leave in bodily form. If not, it would simply appear that he hadn't quite died the first time, but now he really did die as he concluded his time with the disciples. You feel the compelling logic that takes you to this impossible place. So in summary, Jesus had to leave because if he didn't, the mission to the whole world would not be successful, and there would be no sense that Jesus is with God in heaven. There is a story of an evangelist of the 1980s, a man called David Watson. And he used to tell this story because people loved him. He was a charismatic preacher and wonderful. And people, 1,000 people would come to one of his rallies. And he was so successful, people told him. But he replied, no, not really, you know. He explained, look, if you consider just this country, which was the United Kingdom, at that time, it's around 60 million people. Okay. Now, just imagine that I speak to 1,000 people every night. And I do that night after night, right through the year, right through the next year. Do you know how long it would take me? 164 years to reach all the people in Britain. But if 1,000 people come and they in turn tell 2 people, and then those 2,000 people in turn tell 2 people, do you know how long it'll take for everyone in Britain to hear? It's about 16 days. Jesus had to go so that the message could spread. And Jesus had to go in bodily form because that was the revelation of the resurrection from the dead. That death was not the end, but there was a new life in a new body, still a physical body. So this was the inevitable consequence of all that had gone before. Jesus, born in Bethlehem, crucified in Jerusalem, raised from the dead, ascends to God. It's more than that as well. It is so important for us to know that the Jesus who sits at the right hand of God is the Jesus who sat in the temple drawing in the dust. The same Jesus who went to the wedding, who was betrayed. So important that Jesus in heaven is the one who was on earth. That the earthly Jesus is substantially, essentially, the same person on earth as in heaven. Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ of heaven. In Goulburn, during the 1920s and the 1930s in particular, a small religious community formed. They named themselves the Community of the Ascension. And the cross I'm wearing today is a replica of the cross that they wore. The men of the community had hoped to be part of the Community of the Resurrection, formed in England. But it was not to be. But it's striking that both the Community of the Resurrection in Mirfield and this Community of Ascension in Goulburn were formed essentially out of men who were struggling to find a way in the world after the First World War. And I wonder sometimes whether it was because the carnage of that war and the subsequent experiences made it very difficult for some people to make sense of the world in any way at all. And they were drawn both to withdraw from the world and to draw close to Christ. But to do it with this sense of resurrection and ascension, with that conviction that God in heaven is the God that's encountered, who was in creation. For both resurrection and ascension give us a strong focus on life beyond death, remaining in relationship with the one who knows what it is to die innocently, condemned by others. That through resurrection and ascension there is hope. A hope that God in heaven knows exactly what it is like to live in a broken world. It is as though those caught up in the carnage of war needed a God who understood them, who knew what it was like to be whipped, broken, murdered, knew what it was like to feel despair, knew what it was like to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is ascension. The affirmation that resurrection is not some ghostly presence, but something substantial, full of life It's an affirming, joyful declaration that God in heaven is one who knows what it is to live in a broken world. This is our God, Jesus the Christ. In 1928, James Benson, then rector of Badalla, was the only survivor when his car plunged into the Clyde River before the bridge was there. His wife and 4 children died. James joined the community of the Ascension after that time and lived with them for 8 years before he became convinced that he couldn't stay any longer, that he had to tell others about the love of God. And he couldn't move the others in the community. It was too hard for them. But he went as a missionary to Papua New Guinea. And he went to the Guna station. And there in Guna, he was joined by Mavis Parkinson, a young teacher from Queensland, and May Heyman, a nurse from Canberra. And when the Japanese invaded, James and the nurses fled into the interior. James somehow escaped in an ambush. The 2 young women were captured and killed. James remained in a prisoner of war camp until the end of the war. James experienced the loss of his family, the loss of dear young women for whom he must have felt like a father. And yet, after the war, he served in the cathedral at Dugura. And there he painted the most stunning vision of the resurrected Christ in heaven. And this Christ is surrounded by all the people that James knew who had died. And they're ministered to by angels. And they're there as they were, as he knew them, dressed as nurses, teachers. It's a vision of angels serving Jesus. And there is a fullness of joy in that painting. James Benson knew the Ascension, knew that beyond all grief was hope and joy. In the name of Christ, amen.